I'm Gail Simon, and I was going to say this evening, but it's evening in the UK and lunchtime are you in Houston, Harlene?
Houston, yes. It's about 1 p.m., a little after, yeah.
And so, yes, I'm talking with my dear colleague, Harlene Anderson, in Houston, over Zoom, and we're going to have maybe a different kind of conversation, Harlene, to the ones you're usually asked to have, where you're asked to share your theoretical ideas, your practice-related experience, to invite people into different kind of learning and reflective situations. And this is an opportunity for me. I'm very excited about this, and for our imagined viewers, who I'm imagining sitting just behind me in droves, who are really interested and excited to find out a little bit more about you as an all-round person, yeah, who's been living through different time zones, with a range of colleagues, friends and family, different places, different professional identities as well. Many things in play that have happened during your life. And I guess when people ask you, or when you invite people to come and play with you, learn with you, work with you, it's usually with a focus on the actual professional learning.
Right.
So can I just take an opportunity to mention to people some things that they may or may not know about you?
Sure, whatever you would like to say.
Well, I was thinking one of the key things to say is how much of a leader you have been in the field of postmodern social constructionist practice. That includes therapy. I mean, you've worked as a family therapist and still do, and as a relationship therapist, whether with individuals or couples, now with teams and organizations. You've specialized in supervision. You run supervision trainings and workshops. You're a trainer. You're a doctoral supervisor at Taos. You set up the Houston Galveston Institute, and you were a founder of the Taos Institute, where you're still hosting international conferences and workshops, and the very popular one with Sheila McNamee every year on social, how do you call it? What is it?
Something like social construction and relational practices. So we tweak it each year a little bit, but it's basically focusing a lot on the practice.
Yeah, a lot on the practice. So you move between practice and supervision of practice and consultation to people and doctoral supervision as well. And you've also been a founder, or are a founder, of Access Success International. And maybe importantly for me, you've been founding editor of the International Journal of Collaborative and Dialogical Practices. Very special, important, peer-reviewed academic journal. And you've also set up the International Certificate in Collaborative Practices program, which many organizations and individuals are hosting around the world. Maybe some of our viewers, listeners, co-participants have read some of your books. I've actually got some of them behind me. In fact, I'll pick them up. Well, okay. Don't look embarrassed, Harlene. So, Conversation, Language and Possibilities. This was a very shifting of dialogue book when it came out. A lovely read, lovely invitation. And then a couple of edited books. There's another one here that I don't have to hand, but Collaborative Therapy, co-edited with Diane Gerhardt. And this book on innovations in the reflecting process, co-edited with Per Jensen, and then the Appreciative Organization book, which I haven't got here. But I'm also aware of your early papers, some of which you wrote on your own, some of which with your dear colleague Harry Gulishian. In particular for me, the big whammy paper was human systems as linguistic systems. Wow. That was the paradigmatic, pivotal shift for all family therapy and systems practitioners. And that was 1988. I guess you wrote it even a year or so earlier by the time it came out in Family Process. And then there was that wonderful chapter you wrote in Sheila McNamee and Ken Gergen's Therapy as Social Construction book. I think that was 1991 or two. The Client as Expert and Not Knowing Approach to Therapy. That was, again, shifting, very important, reframing, realignment of people and knowledge and practice. And maybe people have heard you speak at a conference. My goodness, you are well traveled. When I looked at your 2019 schedule, it was unbelievable where you've been.
Oh, crazy.
Was there a continent you did not visit during 2019?
Oh, yes, of course.
And maybe people have been to a workshop with you, either your important summer institute at Canaquil in Mexico, maybe the Dialogical Practices conference in the Czech Republic, or one of the Taos anniversary conferences. Maybe people have seen you on video. There's some lovely videos of you on YouTube and Vimeo and other platforms. And of course, you've received several Lifetime Achievement Awards for your services in the field of family and marriage therapy. Anyway, that's a real quick summary, but I'm really thrilled that we have this opportunity to talk this evening about some other experiences, relationships, and so on in your world. So I sent you some questions. So this isn't for our listeners. This isn't you being surprised, wrong-footed by any of the questions, but I still trust that you'll say what you do and don't. You'll make your own editing decisions about how you want to answer. But maybe let's start in a kind of classic way with something biographical about where were you born and what kind of community were you born into?
Hey, I will definitely tell you a little bit about that. But first, I want to say, Gail, thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you. We've been talking about getting together and just sharing ideas and brainstorming, it seems like for years. And as you were reviewing just now, kind of some of my professional history, I was thinking there's a lot of parallel between the two of us. Yes. You do a lot of what I do. Absolutely.
Well, that is beyond generous. And
and I was also thinking of the time that I was able to visit with you and Gwen, and that drive around, and you were talking just now the advantage of living in the countryside and not having to worry about all of these problems with social distancing that we're dealing with here in the United States.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, I was.
Yeah, we went to Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, didn't we? In beautiful old abbey. I must look out those photos. They're somewhere.
Yeah.
But where were you born? What kind of community?
I'm here in Houston, Texas. I am a native Houstonian. I'm a fourth generation Houstonian. And my parents, my mother's grandparents immigrated from Germany, and my father's grandparents immigrated from Sweden, and they both ended up in Texas and in the Houston area. So I grew up in Houston, and I have lived here all of my life, except for times that I worked some other places in Texas, and then also for 6 years in the 80s lived in Boston. So, but I'm a Texas woman, yeah. So I like to think of myself as having some of that pioneer spirit.
So the name Anderson, is that Andersson? Should you be coming from?
That's Swedish, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, with the O. So it's Swedish, yeah, with the O.
So what kind of community were you growing up in?
Well, I come from a middle class family, went to public schools. My father owned his own business, and my mother basically worked in the business, and I would say ran it, because she ran the office and all of that, while chauffeuring my sister and I around. I'm the oldest of two girls, and I have a younger sister. But in a family where the door was always open for people to come in and out and visit, and my parents they had a Bay House, so they always had summer gatherings at the Bay House, and then at their house they always had people over for Christmas Eve, and kind of the same tradition of a group of family and friends that would come together several times during the year. And I loved playing with the neighborhood kids and roller skating up and down the street. That was before there was a lot of traffic. Yeah. And I used to particularly like, with the younger children, to make up stories to tell them, and sit there and just make up stories.
So how would that come about? How would that work? Would you all be sitting around and then suddenly you'd launch into a story? Or what would happen?
Somebody might say something and I would say, oh, I don't remember the details, Gail, but it was really spontaneous. It was oral, just all of a sudden I would start saying, well, do you know, I think around the corner lives this little old woman, and I would just kind of make something up.
And then how would the other kids react?
Well, they were engaged. Yes, they were engaged. And of course, I didn't say anything that was scary, but just kind of made up things. Something would catch my attention, or something someone said, or something I saw. That's just kind of a very small part of my growing up in my childhood.
Yes, but it's of interest, isn't it? Given you're an orator and a storyteller, and that you do have a way of captivating audiences.
Well, perhaps, yes. I can sometimes become animated. And
do you feel you have space to still be a playful storyteller these days? What's the balance in terms of that and work stuff?
I think so. And a lot of it depends on, I think, the people that I'm engaged with. Like if I'm doing a workshop, and how I present, and how less formal I am, and how more spontaneous with my thoughts going here and there. And I can, yes. I remember years ago when I first started training with Harry Galishan and his team, Harry could just stand up anywhere and talk about anything and tell these marvelous stories, and I was just in awe, and I couldn't imagine. And it was not too long ago I thought, well, Harlene, you can just go in. And like the other day, I was going to have a Zoom thing for a conference in Malaysia, and my husband said, well, have you prepared? Are you? And I said, well, I'm prepared, but I don't have a plan. I said, I just feel like I can introduce myself and take off talking about what they asked me to talk about. So I think I've learned to be spontaneous and flexible in that way, to try to fit into whatever the circumstances or the relational context is.
Sometimes I think that street play is an underestimated element in our future life training. It sort of strikes me that seeing Harry do it. Sorry, do you call him Harry or Harold?
Harry.
Seeing Harry do that perhaps created a professional permission of something that you'd been able to do anyway at another time in your life. I worry a lot about how many abilities children have that they're schooled out of during their school years. And
I think it happens, absolutely. Happens to therapists when they're in graduate school in terms of just being natural human beings with another human being.
Yeah.
They think there's a script or a role they must play or a script they must follow.
So what kind of child or teenager were you? Did you fall into being compliant and unlearning the younger child's activities and ways of being, or
I would say I was probably fairly compliant. I certainly was not a troublemaker at all. I abided by the rules. I didn't get into any kind of serious trouble when I was a teenager or when I was a child. And yeah, so, and I somehow we were with somebody the other day, my husband and I, and they were asking me something, and I was remembering, and they said, well, don't you ever get upset or get afraid of something? And I said, well, all of a sudden I'm remembering when I was in kindergarten, and one day they had us all line up, and they didn't tell us what we were being lined up for. And I almost had tears in my eyes. I thought we were going to get a shot or something like that. Well, it ended up they were taking school pictures.
Oh, but they didn't
But
set a context.
I was really worried until I, found out what it was. But
so why were you so compliant? I mean, in a way, you could say that's unusual for a lot of teenagers. A lot of older children are the good kids. They know they have to be. There can be so many reasons why people are compliant. But how come you were so compliant?
That's a good question. Probably because I was more on the shyer side.
Oh, okay.
Might be one reason. I certainly didn't come from a family where parents were like huge disciplinarians or over disciplinarian. Mm-hmm. Like I cannot even ever remember them asking me if I did my homework, because my sister and I, we just did it. We just did our homework. We came home from school and that's what we did. Well, we played first, of course. But that's a good question. I'd really have to think about that, Gail. And if I have a better response, I'll email it.
I'm always amazed that I was on and off compliant at school. And but I'm always amazed that some young people realize that they don't have to comply at all. They've worked that out, that there's and a lot of young people never work that out. They just think the rules are the rules. If you have to line up, you line up and you deal with whatever's coming. But what sort of challenges academically were there for you, or socially, and what came easy to you as a young person, teenage, young adult?
Okay, let me just go back real quick to the compliant thing, because all of a sudden I had a connection.
Okay.
Because I was a, you might want to say, organizer. I would get other kids to join me in doing something. So I was very active in that way. And even today, people say, don't come up with an idea, because the next thing you know, Harlene will have you doing it. Or don't be interested in something she's thinking about, will have you doing it. Mm. So I don't necessarily think of myself that way, but I can appreciate that other people do. But I think because I instigator is a word. I would instigate things, not like big trouble things, but okay, so like one time in high school, I was a cheerleader, and we had, you had mascots. Well, our mascot was a cougar. And so, well, of course, you weren't going to bring a cougar, but we were playing this football team, I guess like for y'all, football, like a soccer team. And their mascot was a bird. It was a cardinal. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? So I had some friends. We got a white chicken and we dyed it red. And I had my father build a little cage, and we took it up on the stage, for preparing for the rally. And, we were going to cage the Cardinals. So wow. Those are the kind of things we did, yeah. So I wasn't really getting into trouble. But academically, I liked school. That was no problem at all. Math was always a challenge, particularly when I got into algebra. and beyond. But yeah.
How did
So
you, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
So how did you, what happened between, how did you find your way into some kind of higher educational and professional education?
Well, I always had the idea, I don't know where it came from, that I wanted to go to college. And then when I was in junior high school, middle school, between, little kids school and high school, I was a volunteer at a hospital. And I was a volunteer for the mail department. So I wore this little, they call it candy stripers, a red and striped dress. And I pushed the mail cart from floor to floor, room to room, and delivered the mail, and would visit with people. And I just began to think that I wanted to do something that would be in the line of helping people, and I didn't know what that would be. And really, the main thing I knew about was psychology and social work, just from my studies and from reading. And I applied to a rather prestigious school that had a very well-known school of social work, and I was accepted, but the tuition was really out of our family budget parameters. So I ended up going to a different school and ended up majoring in psychology. So it's like those kind of thing where I was teenager of the year in the area that I lived. And so they had found out about me by talking with my school principal, and they brought this psychology book and they wanted me to hold it up. So here I am in the newspaper, front page, holding up this psychology book. And the headline was, Harlene Anderson loves helping people and is going to be a psychologist or something like that. So anyway, just things happen, but it's like, how did I decide I wanted to be helpers? I think it also was influenced by my parents. Neither one were in any kind of helping profession. My father was a businessman, and my mother worked in his business for years until he sold it. But they were very generous people. They were very generous with their employees, and they were generous with the schools that I went to. So like I can remember in elementary school, it really didn't make sense to me at the time, but like if some children needed glasses or shoes, my parents were on the list of people to call, and they would generously donate whatever needed to be donated for children's shoes or glasses. So and they were just always helpful with neighbors. My father could do anything, he could fix anything, and so all the neighbors were always asking him, well, would you come over and look at my lawnmower, or the sink stopped up or something, or whatever it might be. The electricity's not on, and he could somehow just manage to do anything, although he never really went to any kind of formal trade school or university to learn to do those things. He just had this natural inclination. So I think that kind of wanting to help, or not only wanting to help people, but always being available to answer a call.
Yeah.
Put it that way.
Sounds like that was a core family value.
I would say it was. Mm-hmm.
And an offshoot of that was the social contact and feeling part of a community or something like that, I'm guessing.
Very much felt part of a community, yes. Because those were the days when you were a member of a neighborhood, so to speak, which you don't have that much in a big city like Houston anymore. Even though I live in a neighborhood and I have next door neighbors in houses and across the street, and I know them. And as a matter of fact, we had a coronavirus happy hour 2 weeks ago on a Friday. One neighbor invited some neighbors to come over and stay 6 feet apart, bring your own drink with you, and just, just so I'm in that kind of neighborhood. But those kinds of things are organized, but it's not the kind where there's someone next door where I might just go knock on the door and say, "What you doing? Want to come out and have a glass of tea?" or something like that. So, but I grew up in that kind of neighborhood. Go ahead.
At what point, if at all, has your profession become a community for you? When do you think that first started to kick in and that you started to feel a member of a professional community?
I think that's when I started working at the medical school in Galveston and started studying family therapy with Harry Galishan and his team. And when I first started at the medical school, I was aware that people were talking. I was in the pediatric department in the child development program, and people were talking about something called family therapy, which I had never heard of in my graduate training up until that point, or any of my work settings. And I thought, family therapy, what is that? And people talked about it with such enthusiasm, and I thought, I wonder what this is. It might be a cult. I don't know. But then I noticed there was a flyer of a training program started out, and I thought, I'm going to go to the training program. And if I go the first time and it seems like a cult, or I don't like these people, or it's too intimidating, or whatever it is, I just won't go back. Nothing lost, nothing gained. Well, I went, and it was like, Gail, I had found something I didn't know I was looking for.
Ooh.
It was that very first time. What it was, the language, the vocabulary in that particular training session invited me to really kind of step back and reflect on some of my professional experiences to that date and that point in time, and to begin to really be aware of multiple realities and the influence of context on one's actions, on one's words, on one's thought, and how one was as a person. It was just amazing. It was like a gift I didn't know I was going to receive.
Mm.
So it was a community where we went to the training, we worked in teams, and so you began to really know each other. And I think that's one of the gifts of family therapy, is that it has created communities for so many people in the training that they are in. Now, I think unfortunately a lot of that doesn't continue after the graduate training or the postgraduate training, which for me it was postgraduate. And so that's very important, and that has to do with my starting the Summer Institute and the certificate program and the journal as a way of having a network or community for people to continue to feel part of, to feel supported by, to feel connected with.
It's really important that people understand journals and summer schools and trainings as an attempt to create and sustain community. Sometimes they look like they're commercial opportunities, and it's nothing to do with that, because there's no money in these things anyway. These are...
What are you going to do with all this money you're making from doing this Summer Institute? And I thought, if you only knew.
Yes, exactly.
With all the hotel and food costs and things.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you experience the same thing, Gail, that people come to your trainings and they come back again and again, and they're part of a community, and they meet up at other trainings in other parts of the world and develop these collegialships that then you're not physically a part of. Yeah.
I'm imagining that when people invite you, when we're invited to workshops, when we put on workshops, it is an act of creating community, but in a sense, you, Harlene, become the means through which community also gets created and recreated through the event, through the kind of exercises and talk, informal and formal. Does it sometimes feel like quite a responsibility having that position of being such a frequently invited speaker, workshop host, trainer, and so on?
It feels like a responsibility in the sense that I want to be accountable. And this is really where I am in my career right now, that how to help people sustain some of what I have been a part of. I won't say that I've created, but what I've been a part of creating. How to sustain that kind of connecting, networking, learning together, really being lifelong learners, and to nurture these professional friendships and colleagueships that people have made over the years, and to continue to help the ideas and practices evolve and emerge and twist and turn whatever way they go. Yeah.
How does the doing your family therapy training, where you met Harry Gulishian, and this ethos around accountability and creating community, and how does that connect with your having co-founded the Houston Galveston Institute and then later on the Taos Institute?
Well, they began in two very different kinds of ways, but both out of relationships, professional relationships. So, for example, excuse me, with the Galveston group, every time we had training, we would a lot of times go over to Harry Gulishian's house, who lived just within walking distance of the medical school, on an outlet of the Gulf of Mexico, of Galveston Bay. And he had a dock, so people would go out on the dock and sit. His wife, Leslie, was just very generous. She would always make huge batches of popcorn or something for people to nibble on. So there was a lot of social. So you were able to learn about people as people in the world, ordinary citizens, not just as your professional neighbor in the little office next door. And this is one of the things that I really think is important, that and often when I'm working with people in organizations and they're having difficulties and trouble with another colleague, I just begin wondering, well, what do you know about this person? Do y'all ever go to lunch or have coffee? No. And it's like, oh my gosh, because you're so different in those kind of more informal, casual, out of the office context than you are in the office. So that, so it's just those kinds of relationships I began to realize were so important. And that you can do trainings, you can invite people to a training, you go 9 to 5, and people come and you start at 9, you take a lunch break, and then you leave at 5, and you may meet again next month, or you may never meet again. But for me, I always want to build in informal social time whenever I can. So sometimes when I do trainings here in Houston, I'll invite people over to my home, or right down from the Houston Galveston Institute, there's a wine bar. So sometimes we'll just walk to the other end of the block to the wine bar. I do assignments over lunchtime and give an extended lunchtime, so people have time to be together and talk with each other outside of the four walls of the training room.
I really like what you're saying, I suppose because it corresponds with some of my own values and experiences, whether at the Bedfordshire Summer School or in the professional doctorate in systemic practice that I lead. I always say to people, we need to be able to eat together at least once or twice during the meeting of a few days, and it's what happens in the evening over wine, or going for a walk, or a walk before breakfast, or whatever it is. It's in that space that creates, I'm going to put it like this, real relationships, meaningful relationships, getting to know each other, sustaining each other through studies. And it worries me also that people go and do trainings now in human relations where there isn't much space to be human and relational.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. No, continue, please.
Well, just that I would love to see many trainings reinvent themselves and find ways of opening space so that people can participate even with their children and partners in the wings or whatever, so that they can still socialize and be present, not have to run home. That's very difficult. It's an ideal, but I love those values, and I'm wondering where I picked them up from. And I feel that it's from probably from people like you and others. And KCC was like that. When I was doing my own doctorate, it was like that. We would go out for dinner with John Schotter and Peter Lang and Martin Little and others, and drink and talk and eat and hang out.
Right, that the trainers, so to speak, were available as people to spend time with you. And Gail, I also tend to favor residential trainings like the Summer Institute, because it becomes kind of a 24/7 learning experience. You think people are sitting on the beach for 3 hours in the afternoon? Yes, they are, but what are they doing? Or what are they doing while they're going on a boat ride or they're shopping? They're talking about what's been going on. It's amazing. It really, really is. And when I consult with graduate programs, I always talk about that I think graduate programs should be a laboratory in human relationships. That the program itself should allow people to begin to continue to develop as people, not only as professionals.
So is, for example, the Houston Galveston Institute, is it allied to a university? Because what's happened in the UK is all the family therapy trainings, for example, have all the institutes that were independent over the years have had to become aligned with the university and mirror pure academic training. So there may be a placement, but it's almost separate from the learning of theory. And although people have live clinics, live supervision, there still isn't that space. It's all in the domain of production, and the domain of aesthetics is within the writing and within the practice, and not always within the group.
Well, the institute is not connected formally with a university. I would say probably all of the faculty, and I'm including local faculty as well as our international faculty, are affiliated with and do teaching at a university in some way, usually on a visiting professorship or as an adjunct faculty member. And one of the things that Harry Galishan and I always said, because people would ask us, well, why don't you partner with a university? Because there are several in the Houston area. And we would say that would totally change what we do.
Yeah.
We couldn't do what we do because of the rigidity. Yeah.
And how many countries is the certificate in collaborative and dialogical practices? Where's it happening?
Well, I think we have 17 programs probably in 13 or 14 countries now. It started because people would come to the Summer Institute and get so involved in the ideas, or I'd meet people in workshops and they wanted to know, where could we do this training? I can't come to Houston for a long training period. And so Harry Galishan and I started doing what we called a summer intensive. And we did that in Galveston. It was strictly, there was some around the table talking, but it was mostly clinical work where we would see lots and lots of families or individuals or couples, or do consultation with business people, and people would watch and then we would talk about it and go to lunch, go to dinner, go have drinks, etc. So where am I going with this, Gail? Let's see.
Well, I was asking about the certificates where it's happening. And
so what I did is I decided, well, why don't I just bring together a few people that I knew, like 4 or 5 people, and share with them this idea. Is there some way that we can create a program in different areas of the world? And the people that I first talked with happened to be in Mexico, in the States, and in South America. I think there were 5 that started. And so that's what we did. We just put together a curriculum. And these were people who already had training programs. And at that time, none of them associated with the university. And what we have found is that over time, we have had 1, 2, 3 programs that I can think of right this moment that have been associated with universities where that relationship has dissolved because of the restrictions. And whether the restriction is, we will not support your program and you unless you have a minimum of 25 students.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a certain kind of economic basis to these things. And,
right.
yeah.
Yes.
Mm-mm.
And so that's, yeah. And so that was mainly it. It mainly had to do around finances and the university wanting a certain amount of money, a certain amount of percentage.
Well,
Or a certain,
there are huge advantages to trying to be independent in order, a bit like Houston Galveston Institute and the Taos Institute, because they create, you can create pretty much what you think is needed, and respond to, yeah, your own imagination and other people's interests. That's
right. And you have that kind of freedom, that kind of liberty. And the challenge is then how to pay for it.
Yeah, there's always that.
There's always that. So
there's always that. I wanted to jump back to something actually and ask you about some examples of relationships in work that have been really, well, maybe outside of work as well, but I was thinking about colleagues who've been really influential for you in your career. You mentioned Harry Gulishian. I don't know if you wanted to say more about him or others that...
Well, I would say Harry was certainly a major influence when I met him and started learning family therapy, and just and then watching everything that he did. And it just so happened that my supervisor, my psychology supervisor in my department at the medical school in pediatrics, decided to join this family therapy seminar because I went to him, and his name was Bob, and I said, Bob, at the end of the first day, and this is like being intimidated and then figuring out a way to manage it. At the end of the first day of training, Harry Gulishian said, okay, you can only be in this training if you're seeing families. And I thought, oh no. I mean, by this time I had already found what I didn't know I was looking for, or at least a part of it. And I thought, what am I going to do? That's why I'm here. I wouldn't even know what to do with a family in the room. So I go back to pediatrics and I talk to my supervisor and I say, well, I really want to go to this training and I can't go unless I'm seeing families. So would you go to the training with me? And could we just, the very next referral that came in, could we call it a family? And it just so happened the next referral was a family that had just recently immigrated from Cuba, a father and a mother and a little boy who was about 8 or 10 years old. And we decided we were going to do family therapy with them. So we made the appointment. We met with all three of them. Bob went to the seminar with me and we had a family. And then just by the luck of the draw, we had Harry Gulishian as our supervisor. So that was just, that was just amazing. Like, oh my gosh. And, but yeah, Harry was a huge influence. Just, I mean, I would go with him when he did trainings and things and just really watch what he did. And just always just so amazed at what he could do.
Can I just ask you about that, the watching what he did? There are a lot of family therapy trainings these days and other psychotherapy trainings that don't show videos of people working. They don't. And a colleague of mine who Kate Stewart, who worked in Bradford many years ago, or maybe still does, wrote her master's dissertation on imitation. And it was a critical view of imitation. I don't mean critical negative. I just mean she was talking about how important it is to see your supervisors working with families. And
Absolutely.
the trend at the time was that it was discouraged. You had to apparently invent it out of the air based on papers you'd read. And I wondered what you thought about that based on what you're saying now.
Well, that was the one thing about the family therapy program, is that we got to see other people do therapy. So we got to see Harry do therapy, or the other faculty do therapy. We were invited to view sessions, and I really value what I call an apprenticeship model of learning any kind of human service, in any kind of human service profession. That you work along people and you learn with them, you learn from them, and it's not emulating them. You don't want to duplicate what they do. You can't do that. I could never be Harry Galishan or John Schotter or Gail Simon or whoever it might be. I could never do that. I can only be me. But how can I take things that sort of catch my attention or touch me and think about those conceptually? Okay, so what is that about? That's about having good manners, or that's about not being intrusive in someone else's life, and that I can do that in my way. So that's one of the things that I think. But certainly Harry was a major influence. I would say later on Ken Gergen, certainly John Schotter was a huge influence in terms of the way that I thought about things, in terms of giving me a language, a vocabulary to be able to better describe and articulate what I thought was happening in my work and what clients would say.
I remember walking down the street with you and John Schotter in Harrogate a million years ago. Well, it wasn't a million, but nearly a million. And really feeling your sensitive appreciation of him as a person. And it felt like, I think you were co-presenting, I'd invited you to co-present a workshop, I'm remembering now. You were very complimentary to each other, because of course John wasn't trained as a psychotherapist. He was trained as a relational human being, but there was something about how you both fed into each other's ideas that was very powerful and very generative for the rest of us.
Interesting, yeah, because I always felt that kind of connection and that kind of, in some way we complemented each other. Yes. So we didn't work together that much, but when we did, it went smoothly, and I could incorporate what John was saying and what I was doing, or as my comments on what I thought I might be doing. And John would refer to my work, and he did that a lot, like for example with Tom Anderson and Jaakko Sekula. But that was, yeah. He left us much too soon, as many people have, many of these men.
Yeah.
All in the same age range. When you think of John and Harry and Tom and
yes.
And
yes, quite a few losses for you in that respect, in terms of people who are important to you.
And then the woman that was the most influential was Lynn Hoffman. Yeah, I just loved watching her teach, talk, reading everything that she wrote. Yeah, she's just, and I have to attribute the title of Conversation, Language, and Possibilities to Lynn, because it came out of a conversation with her. I was going to call it Conversation and something, Postmodern Conversations or something like that. And we were just talking, and out of talking with her, out came this title. So, yeah.
Let me just ask you a quick question then about each of those people. If there was something that you felt people should read from each of those influences on you, and I know that, yeah, this might be asking too much off the top of your head, but what would you say Lynn's most important work that contemporary postmodern social constructionist practitioners should read? Same with John, same with, well, which work of Harry's would you have suggested?
Okay,
Maybe
so
Tom.
I would say her two major books, and I'll tell you why. Foundations of Family Therapy and Family Therapy and Intimate History, because because I think what we're talking about now and the ideas that both of you are kind of playing with on the edge, both of us are playing with on the edge, originated within family therapy or from people who were first family therapists. I think that's my take on it. And I think that if you look at her writing, she's not giving you a description so that you can learn to be all these kinds of therapists that she talks about in Foundations of Family Therapy. But you get a sense of the evolution of the conceptual framework. You get a sense of the evolution of the ideas and the practice. And I think that's a value. And I think the same with Family Therapy and Intimate History, where she ends kind of where some people were beginning to take off.
Okay.
And she, I can't think of an example now, but she would give language to things.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's what I would say. I mean, she has numerous journal articles. They're all wonderful, but I think anyone wanting to be a postmodern social construction therapist can learn a lot by particularly reading Family Therapy and Intimate History.
Yeah. Lynn, a great writer, great practitioner.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And what would you say about, would you pick a particular paper from John Schotter?
Oh,
there's so many. It's a really ridiculous question. You can scrap that if you want.
Yeah, what I'll say about John Schotter's paper is pick any one and read it over and over again, which I did. So every time I would go on a flight, I would tell John, I'm taking you with me. I've read this paper 5 times, but I'm reading it again on the flight. And always something new would pop up, or I'd have a new idea or something new I'd write in the margin. So I think anything. And then I think the book that you were so, I think, instrumental in getting him to write.
The Speaking Actually, his last book. Yeah, that's also very precious. Any other writing from some of your key influences that you want to mention? I've mentioned the Human Systems as Linguistic Systems paper.
Well, that's one of my favorites. Yeah. Harry and I put that together. And the history of that paper, we had written another paper similar to that, which had been published in a psychology journal. And then when I was living in Boston, Harry came up to do a workshop. And at the workshop, Carla Slutsky came to the workshop. And at the end, he talked to Harry and to me, and he says, I want a paper on this, please. Yeah. So Harry never wanted to write. In his early career, he wrote a lot, but he was in experimental and learning psychology. But later on, he said no, because if you write something, somebody pinpoints you right there in time. He used to say, you can tell when someone trained me by the way they talk about their work or the way they talk about my work. So he never really wanted to write. But we had written a couple of other things before that were invitational, but nothing spontaneous. So we wrote that paper, and it's amazing.
It's amazing. It must have been so exciting to be involved in that moment, in the putting together of those ideas.
It was an exciting time that was probably more exciting than I realized at the time. But then you go back and you read things that you've written, and there are a couple of things in there that I would talk about differently now. Probably more than that, there too. It's like, oh.
We're writing from within our time, and we will always want to change some things about what we've written.
That's right. We always do. Like something that I may have written yesterday, I go back and I read it and go, oh, how did I say that? Why did I say that? So let's see. So that paper, it's amazing that it's still alive and that people still relate to it, and that it's kind of, for many programs of family therapy or systemic therapy, one of the foundational papers.
Yeah.
And Conversation, Language, and Possibilities. I'm really proud of that book. That's a book that Harry and I had a contract, uh,
Ah,
right? And it was actually an invited book by an author at Basic Books, which is multiple changes since then. And so we agreed to write a book. And we, just before Harry died, we had decided that over the holiday period of Thanksgiving and New Year's, we were going to block out 3, 4, 5 weeks, as many as we could, and we were going to start on that book. And then Harry died. And then I was, spent time trying to get my sea legs, so to speak. What am I going to do now? And people were always asking me, okay, so what are you going to do? You're going to close the Institute? What are you going to do? I said, over my dead body, I'm not closing the Institute. Absolutely not.
wow.
And so then one day the phone rings, and it's this editor from Basic Books, and she says, I'm just following up because you and Harry Gullishan had a contract to write this book, and it's a 5-year contract, and that contract is ending like within a few months.
Oh.
And she said, so I guess you're not going to write this book. I said, oh, I'm going to write this book. I'm going to write that book. And I did.
So what happened then?
I just decided I'm going to write the book. And that was Conversation, Language, and Possibilities.
Wow, what a story.
I just decided, oh, I'm going to write this book. I can't pass up this opportunity. And learning experience, because when you write, you do a lot of thinking in preparation, you do a lot of reading, a lot of research, you talk to people, you make lots of notes. I mean, there's just so much that goes into it. So it was a great experience, and I don't know. And so I was writing that book. I lived in Houston at the time that I was writing that book. That was just before I had moved to Boston. And I just sequestered myself up in my office at my home. And that's what I decided to do.
Wow. It must have taken a lot. Did you feel you were carrying Harry with you in some ways, or had you sort of in a way moved on and realized you passed through that apprenticeship, collegial relationship with him, and had now sort of launching yourself more as, or had been more your own person?
By then I had developed really more my own professional identity rather than an identity as this professional pair.
Yeah, because quite a few years had gone by then.
By this time it had been 5 years, because he died and we never started writing on the book. He died that November that we were talking about. So I can't say that I think he was with me in a real sort of conscious way all the time, but certainly his influence was there. His ideas were there. Notes from our conversations were there.
Well, how do you think your very varied and many theoretical premises, your gifts to practice, have been valued in different parts of the world? My colleague Fran Urbistondo-Cano, who you've met when he came to talk with you about John Schotter's work a few years ago, he asked me today, Harlene travels a lot, but more and more to Asia, including Taiwan and China. And he was very interested in how you perceive the connection between your ideas, your values, because I do think your theories are values, and those cultures in, for example, China or Taiwan.
It's been very, very surprising. And what I have found out and what people there tell me is that there's a connection between some traditional Chinese philosophies and some of the things that I draw from and talk about and the way that I practice. They see a connection. That's the way that they describe it. And that it makes it's made sense to me as I've begun to learn more about Buddhism or Zen, which I don't know a lot about. I won't say I know much about it all. I have a.
Do you think how people in other cultures value some of these collaborative and dialogical practices? Do you think that it shows up something about Western culture or American culture in particular, about how other people use these ideas? I don't quite know what I'm asking here.
Well, it's really interesting because as I think about some of the Asian countries, and particularly China, which is so hierarchical, that's my description. And but yet, the people that I know there, and I've been going to China now for several years, at least 8 years, if not longer, 3, sometimes 4, 5 times a year, a lot. They've developed these professional communities around these ideas, and now and I'm not saying this is me, I'm just saying it's the way that people have taken the ideas, but in the China Academy of Science, the psychology department has a postmodern psychology division.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
really amazing. Now, I don't know what's happening, but my name just came up on the screen.
Yeah, it looks like your camera's just disappeared.
No, it's
There, you're back. So that's amazing. So they've developed.
It is amazing. There's a lot of interest. However, I think people are very cautious.
Because?
I think cautious in terms of trying to maybe present something too energetically, too publicly, that's new and different. The first, well, for example, in China, and again, this is my story, but from what I've heard, is that psychology and psychiatry was introduced in China from a psychoanalytic perspective. So there's a lot of that influence. In terms of any family therapy that's done there, it was influenced by a group in Germany, not Helm Sterling's group, but another family therapy group who came and did a lot of training and ended up having people go over to Germany and train. So I don't know, you're asking some important thought-provoking questions. And as a matter of fact, I've asked a colleague of mine who's really teaching and writing about these ideas and very much a scholar when it comes to traditional Chinese philosophy, if he would write a paper with a journal doing kind of a comparison and a contrast. And he's supposedly working on that. We'll see.
I think it sounds like there's a lot of interesting learning to come out of that relationship, or those relationships.
Yeah, I've had so many interesting experiences, absolutely. Yeah, and some things that I'll be careful and I won't say publicly on a recording.
Okay. I understand there's some kind of delicate political things that
cultural things, and then when you get into Taiwan and China, I go to Taiwan a lot too. So
I'm interested in what have been some of the collaborative dialogical highlights for you in your life career? Yeah.
Oh wow.
I mean, you lived through some very interesting times politically, paradigmatically, professionally, the linguistic and the postmodern turns. I mean, you've been not just living through them, you've been part of them. And you've seen that the field move from method-led to ethics-led, to much more emphasis on relational ethics and collaboratively led ways of working. but also there's that pull in the world. Well, I'll come on to that in a moment. But what have been some of the most important highlights for you around collaborative?
I kind of go back to people. One is Tom Anderson and summer conferences in northern Norway, and the colleagueship and the friendship that Harry Galish and I developed with him, and learning with him, from him, experimenting with him. That was, I would say that Scandinavian connection with Tom Anderson and his colleagues was a very important part of my development, part of my life, part of my career, part of my ideas and my practice. And one of the original members of the Reflecting team, Anna Margrethe Flom, and I are still colleagues and keep contact and see each other in various parts of the world. And she comes to the Summer Institute, and sometimes I go to Northern Norway. So that connection has been very influential. And in what Tom has was able to do to invite interest in the ideas and the practices. So that's been very important. I think also the people who are heading up the certificate programs and what they're doing, just amazing how no two are alike. They're all so different. They're all they cover the same basic curriculum, same basic quote unquote readings, but they're organized in their own way. You know, they have the same number of hours of this and the same number of hours of that, but they do it all so differently.
That sounds fascinating. I love the sound of that. You issue an invitation, you offer some structure, and still what comes back at you is something unexpected.
Right. It's really a decentralized program. And it's a program that's sponsored by the Houston Galveston Institute and the Taos Institute, for which we don't make money off of it. We charge a very nominal administrative fee to pay the person who's the executive director of it to help keep up with all of this. But no, they each have their own unique personality. So for example, one decided they were going to require their students to have projects. So each student had to have a project, but what happened is that they were doing it not individually, but in combinations of pairs or small teams. And then what they did at the end of the year, they had an open, no charge, one-day workshop for people in the community, at the community agencies. And the students each presented their project. And so then that took off. Now we have several that do the same thing. And then we have one program that started having, she has a very fascinating name for it. I'll think of it in a minute, but it's kind of like a reunion where she invites people from all the past programs to come together for a residential 2 or 3 days where they spend time together and reconnect and talk about what they're doing and learn with each other. And so now we have other programs that are trying to figure out ways of doing that doesn't cost a lot of money.
It's very important. It's part of your legacy that other people run with these ideas and develop them across a number of different contexts and countries and so on. What do you see as some of your more important gifts to the I don't know what to call them, therapeutic professions, transformative professions, and which of those things that you most value do you think are most likely to thrive, and which are sort of threatened or being eclipsed by other methodological trends?
I think most of the things have to do, I'll say, with the person of the therapist, so to speak. That people are being more careful, more reflective, paying more attention to their own practice and learning from it. In other words, being a reflective or reflexive practitioner. That I think people are being more spontaneous, more flexible, less knowing. It was like, okay, so was it? I have to think of what, this is Wednesday. Okay, so it was Monday night. I had been invited to do a Zoom presentation at a conference that was hosted in Malaysia. Very, very, very traditional psychology conference, an Asian conference. And so I thought about, what am I going to do? And then I logged in early. My presentation wasn't, with the time change, it was like 9:15 at night. Well, 9:15 at night, I don't even think. I'm thinking about going to bed and getting a good night's sleep. I don't go to bed at 9:15, but anyway, I don't stay up till midnight or 1. But so I gave some thought to what I was going to talk about based on what they wanted me to talk about, and then I decided to tune in to the presentation before me. And oh my gosh, as I was listening to it and as I was listening to the questions that the people were asking, it was a big Zoom format. And I thought, why did they invite me? What am I going to say? How is this going to be received? But then what I found out is that most of the people there were practitioners. And so the people who were in my session seemed very interested, asked very interesting questions. And I didn't even finish my whole presentation that I had spent so much time worrying over and fretting over. What in the world am I going to say that's going to make any sense to people who are talking about schemas and the history of PTSD? It's like, oh my gosh. But
we're pushing on an open door with a lot of these values, these ways of being. Which do you think are going to carry on being taken up, and where? Where do you think the threat could come from?
I think the threat is mainly coming from the West.
Ah, that's interesting.
From this side of the Atlantic, which I have seen the influence jump over to your side of the Atlantic over the years of my traveling to Scandinavian, European countries, and things becoming more formalized. Like when we were talking about universities, that now the training's in universities, not in postgraduate institutes. Or if it's a postgraduate institute, it's one that's part of a university and they have all of this structure. So I think where my hope is that there's some people who are very interested in these ideas. Their profession is built around it, and they're starting to do their own teaching, their own training, their own supervision, and exploring in various areas. So I think that's what's going to happen. And as a matter of fact, Diane Gerhardt and I are in the process now of editing a book after collaborative therapy. An editor there contacted us and asked us if we would do a revised edition.
Oh, okay.
And I'd already been thinking about doing another book, but not a revised edition. And so Diane and I talked, and we met with one of the editors, actually from London, who happened to be at a WMFT meeting in Texas, and I went up there to meet with the two of them. And so I said, well, I've been thinking about a different kind of book. I'm really not interested in doing another book on family therapy.
Yeah.
And I'm not interested in doing a book with the same chapters. I said, I'm more interested in how people are taking these ideas, and myself included, into other contexts, other arenas.
Uh-huh.
Whether that's education, whether that's research, education in terms of like public school, primary education, or whether that's university graduate education, working in organizations, working in communities. And so I began thinking of people that I had met who are doing really interesting things. And I contacted several of them, and I'm going to have a really interesting book.
Oh, wow.
So,
that's really interesting. So it's gone more transdisciplinary.
It's going to be more transdisciplinary, and have no idea what
And trans-professional by the sounds of it.
Transdisciplinary, transprofessional, transcultural, because some of the chapter will talk about how these ideas are used in indigenous cultures.
Yeah.
Mayan cultures. Yeah. So that's what I'm interested in and involved in. And so that's the kind of difference that I would like to continue making.
That's wonderful. And a whole nother session for another time. It would be so fascinating to hear, because of the amount of travel and transcultural conversation you're involved in. It would be really interesting to hear how either where there's a fit or where there are differences between your theories and ideas, the theories and values of collaborative dialogical postmodern practice, and where there's a sort of reflexive, emergent, co-generative influence of all cultures feeding into each other.
Yes. And I find that and those challenges exciting. I think in my work, I find that there is a fit. That in cultures, and I use culture in the broadest sense, whether you're talking about a national culture, a local geographic culture, a family culture, where I find the biggest challenge is from academia and people coming to trainings where they have spent years training to be an analyst, and they just happened because somebody invited them to come to one of my trainings. Being able to incorporate it, if you can incorporate it, but being intrigued, but not knowing what to do. I've spent my life, my career doing this. This is what people expect of me. In my country, when you go to the doctor, you want the doctor to tell you what to do. You want them to give you a prescription. I've had people say that, yes. And so how do I not know? Well, it isn't that you not know, it's just that you think about knowing and what you know very differently. And you use what you know very differently. And you not only use what you know, but you use what the client brings. So it's
you've lived through a big shift around authority in family therapy culture, because I'm sort of thinking about some of the earlier ideas around, for example, gender in the family and where authority was located. I'm thinking about, some of Minuchin's earlier, Salvador Minuchin's idea, and not just his, but other people's ideas about who was wearing the pants, who you addressed as the family therapist in terms of asking questions about decision making, and you modeled, you indicated by your behaviors as a therapist where the authority was or should have been located in the family. And then to sort of have moved in a way so quickly, when you look at the time frame, we're talking probably 5 years, and there was an overlap which continued, with no critique around gender or ethnicity, and where power was located, and then to move into deauthorizing the power in that way. And that's where I was thinking it would make for a really fascinating session to talk about some of the transcultural uses of collaborative dialogic, to think about how they work across different cultures where there may be different expectations about how authority works in different communities or in families and so on. But we might have to shelve that. And
yeah. Well, even just taking off on that for a minute,
yeah.
did it delete authority from your vocabulary? I mean, from your thinking cap. I don't even think about authority these days. I don't think about power and authority. I don't think about gender issues.
But some people have to. I mean, I think this is why it's such an interesting topic, because for some people they're living those inequalities, but it could be a real relief for them to be experiencing therapy or workplace consultation where that isn't. seen as an issue. It's something. It's an area of interest for me about how we promote collaborative dialogical. Sorry,
Yeah.
the signals got delayed. You speak.
Oh, that yeah, I got a message that since my connection's unstable. I don't know why, but anyway,
Okay.
that I would hope that as a person I live that. Now, if someone wants to talk about it, I can certainly talk about it with them. If it's a course where that's supposed to be specifically addressed in that kind of way as a part of a curriculum, I can do that. But I would hope that I live it.
Yeah, yeah. It's also about. I was thinking about how does that work across different cultures, but as I say, I'm flagging that because it's a longer discussion.
It's no longer
Thinking about Chinese culture, British culture, different parts of British culture, where there and different parts of workplace culture, where some workplaces are very hierarchical, others more supposedly democratic. So very interesting to think and learn more about how that works in different contexts. But we're nearly out of time, and you must be tired, and I'm not tired yet because I'm still energized. But I want to ask a couple of questions. I want to ask what you're most proud of, and also I'd like to know. No, I'm just going to stay with that question because if I ask a follow-up, I have a feeling you'll duck that question. So, Harlene, what are you most proud of to do with your work and life achievements to date?
that I've been able to, I'll get very emotional, but I've been able to carry on with something that Harry Golish and I, and it's not just the two of us, but a whole cadre of colleagues, were in the process of creating, that they were beginning to create before I even came along. And that I have been able to, I'll say, do what the occasion calls for. I think that the path I have taken has allowed me to be more spontaneous, more natural, more flexible, to take more risk, to be outrageous if I need to be, which I can be. Most people don't see that part of me, but I can be. Yeah, so I would say the person I am in the very, 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 very small way that I contribute to other people's lives, and they in turn contribute to mine. I feel very privileged in the work that I do, the people that I meet, and how they open that door and let me in.
That's lovely to hear you say that. And of course, I won't be the only one who's really curious to know about how you've been outrageous or whatever it was you put at time. But another question then, maybe to end with, or nearly to end with. I don't know what will happen next after this question, but it's the last one I've got written down. But you honor a lot of people. You've honored a lot of people. You're very much a relationally situated person and a relationally inspired person. But how would you like to be honored and remembered? What would you like people to remember about you, your contributions?
Let me think. I think more the way I am as a person. And that For the most part, I won't say always, because if you ask my husband or my sister, they may have a different story. But for the most time, I walk my talk and I talk my walk. In other words, I have some consistency, some congruency in who I am and present myself professionally in those relationships and in my personal relationships.
That fits with what I think I and others would know about you. Your graciousness, your hospitality. In fact, I had a dream last night. I had a dream that and it was a lockdown dream, a coronavirus lockdown dream, that I flew to Houston to interview you, to talk with you. Don't like the interview word. And I was with Gwyn and our dog Moss, and we drove from the airport to see you, and we got out the car when we arrived at wherever your house was in my imagination of my dreams. And you immediately said, let's go for a walk, because you must be tired of sitting in the car and traveling on the plane. And we went for a lovely walk by a stream. The dog ran in the stream. And I remember thinking, this is so Harlene. She absolutely knows what to do in every situation to put people at their ease, to make people feel welcome and thought about. And it was all very low key. There was no big hype. We were allowed to be weary travelers and land. And I thought that was really a fascinating reminder of you as I woke up this morning, anticipating our talk this evening today.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Gwen. Yes, and I would hope that I would have invited you in a way that if you were so tired after that cross-Atlantic flight, and changing airports if you had to, probably not, probably didn't have to do that coming to Houston, that you would have said so and that would have been okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Harlene, are there some things that I should have asked you, or that were either in your mind or on the list of things, or something you think, oh, I wish Gail had asked me about that a bit more, or that you wanted to say anything?
Not really. You told me the kind of the general things you wanted to talk about, and that you really wanted it to be more about me as a person. And I guess there's just so much. It's like, where do you start? Where do you pause? What can you include? So no, we've covered a lot of things.
So what, are you at home with David this evening?
I am.
And what are you going to be doing this evening? Will you have dinner? What are you going to eat? Who will cook?
Well, after this call, we're going to go back to our dining room table, and I'm going to begin to try to explain to him how I've done my part of the taxes.
Oh my God.
That's our project, yes.
It's that time of year.
Yeah. And then for dinner, we did what do they call it now? They call it pickup. They call it pickup. We did a pickup at a restaurant that we really like. And so I got enough to have for tonight as well. So we're not cooking tonight.
That's good. What sort of food is it that you like eating?
Oh, I eat just about anything. I love seafood. So I have got salmon for me for last night and salmon for me tonight. Yes. So I love seafood. I grew up with a family that had a bay house and went crabbing all the time and fishing, and yeah, so I was a water rat.
How wonderful. How wonderful.
We'll probably take a walk, because we do live in a neighborhood not with any streams anywhere near, but a nice area to walk with some nice trees. So, but it's a neighborhood. It's not like in the countryside. So we'll probably do that.
That sounds really nice. And thank you so much for making time for this conversation, for me, for our wider community, people we've met, people we haven't yet met or maybe never will. That was really lovely. I've had a fantastic time just listening to you and hearing some of the things. I really would have loved for us just to have had 3, 4, 8 days just of being able to follow up with talks and so on.
And for me to learn more about you, likewise. No, it's been lovely for me spending this time with you, and I was looking forward to it, as I had said in our email exchanges. And yeah, we haven't had face-to-face connections that many times over the years, but I have valued the time that we have. I loved it when you came to the Tilburg dissertation defense. You had on your black robe and your hat and your red tennis shoes. I said, I loved it. I don't know if you do that, but I do. So
Good. I hope to see you in person again at some point, Harlene, especially after lockdown is up. Maybe
yeah, if we can ever get on a plane again.
Yeah, absolutely. But we'll try and make something happen.
We've been trying to do it, but the last 5 years maybe. Try to find a time.
We have to try harder. I'm going to stop recording, and so we can say goodbye, and then we can hang on the line for a minute just to say an unrecorded goodbye. But thank you, Harlene Anderson, for this wonderful opportunity.
And thank those of you who will be listening in and watching this conversation between Gail and me. To be continued.
To be continued.